listen, we don't have much time. Go check the last video about morning. Maybe that could help you out. But it's a very important moment right now. You know what time is it? I'm even more excited to present to you, Jason! I don't think that he hears me. Hi, Jason!
Hello.
People, if you don't know what the heck is happening right now, this is Jason.
Hello.
This is a biopsychologist. He's the CEO of RAD, Rise Above the Disorder, which is like a NGO that helps people like you, like me, to find the therapy that they need. Because like you or like me, they have issues like either like paying for it or like finding it. What is he doing here? Today he will be talking to us about a very important topic that each one of us have been experiencing, which is how to deal with failure. Failure. What actually is failure and everything that is around it. So, first of all, let's all welcome here Jason. As the first question that I would like to ask you, since we know that you study biopsychology, you studied in biopsychology, and which is the study of how psychology can also affect biologically or our own organism. So I wanted to ask you, what happens to our body when we experience failure?
Failure is really interesting. What we're actually looking at a lot of the time is our fear response in looking at a cycle of anxiety. Now, there technically is a phobia related to failure. There's also similarly a phobia related to the fear of success, but ultimately we're looking at the fear portion of this, where our brains seem to really specialize versus many other animals is our ability to anticipate fear, to predict fear, although not always accurate, then further respond to that anticipation in a way that we think is appropriate. So, what that can actually look like is someone is getting ready for a test that is coming up, and they might have some fear that if they fail that test, they won't be able to get into the school that they want to get into, or they might not get the job that they want to get. Even though they haven't taken the test, even though they haven't failed the test, they're building up a sense of fear and anxiety towards the possibility of failing that test. That's where we tend to get stuck the most. There's no way to know that that is true, but it makes sense for our brain to want to anticipate that so that we protect ourselves in a way. Even based off of our own life experiences, this essentially exists to protect us, but sometimes it is very misleading, and failure from our life experience oftentimes leads to a lot of painful feelings, more painful experiences, and usually not something we want to experience again.
We understood how it looks like. But is there any difference between how it looks like for an adult and how it looks for a child? Especially, is it easier to move on from a failure when you're a kid and when you're an adult?
Potentially, a lot of the research out there shows that fear is one of the things that really just impacts us biologically in a pretty serious, substantial way. And fears are pretty hard to remove. As far as our brain is concerned and our body is concerned, fear is a very important motivator. Avoiding fear is the most common motivator, and overcoming that is a huge challenge. Now, as a child, you're having a lot of experiences for the first time. You're testing boundaries and you're getting to understand the world around you. So sometimes you'll experience something one way and then re-experience it in a completely different way. And children seem to be a lot better about relearning things versus adults who might have just really ingrained a certain fear, a certain experience into the brain. I don't think there is an advantage or disadvantage either way. Certainly, a lot of these fears begin in childhood when we're just open to these experiences. As adults, if these fears continue to serve us in some kind of way, they can be especially hard to remove. So, even when we look at treatment, a lot of it becomes identifying how these fears no longer serve us and being able to address them in that sense.
think that there is like this question that is coming out also from chat. As I keep seeing people say, is it okay to be a failure? Can failure be passed on? Is there anything as being a failure? Like we all know the answer because we keep hearing like, oh yeah, you're not a failure. You're just mistakes at making you. I don't know, but yeah, the quotes like, yeah, failure doesn't exist. There's nothing like failure.
It's a mindset, right? And it's subjective. How we define failure is very, very different. And I mean, it's not uncommon for somebody who objectively is successful to self define themselves as a failure. We see this a lot with imposter syndrome, where somebody who is arguably very successful will convince themselves that they are not, or that they don't deserve any of the success that they have. We definitely love when we run into those people who want to make us feel more motivated, even if it's very temporary. But the idea that failure is something that is genetic, it's too subjective. As a human animal, success is being alive and to some extent reproducing. I guess you're very successful regardless. You exist, you've succeeded at existing. But then there's the very harsh reality sometimes of how we societally, culturally define success and failure. If we're not making certain amount of money, if we're not having certain experiences romantically, if we don't wear certain things, we can't afford certain things, all these things start to come into how we self-define, and then further how others around us define us, which also, again, very subjective, changes from culture to culture, place to place. The reality of all of these things is that when we want to address the fear of failure, just being able to identify it initially is a huge, huge part of that. Identifying that this is a feeling that is being created, this is a fear that exists. That's all it is. We tend to mix up and confuse that our thoughts are reality when our thoughts are not inherently reality. They're just thoughts. A lot of the times, these thoughts are not based in truth. They're based in anticipation. They're based in fear. They're based in anxiety, concern. These are all things that we can start to disassociate with. We can change those thoughts. And then oftentimes the people that we see as very successful tend to be the ones that have completely redefined what success is for them. They've redefined what failure is. They no longer see failure as something to avoid so much as they see failure as just a part of life that can be learned from. And we hear those things and we value those, and then our experience, we're like, yeah, but that's not me. That never happens. Like, I actually just don't want to fail. Also worth mentioning, the fear of failure often gets mixed up with the fear of success. Those are two different things. Some people genuinely fear success, and some people genuinely fear failure. One of my favorite people that I had met within the gaming industry, I remember we were sitting down and we were talking about working on an event. My concern was that the event would be a failure, it would be embarrassing, and I'd be ashamed and I would be judged for that failure. Now, he trying to kind of help me by saying something wise, since he'd been in the industry for so long, actually said something that was more reflective of the fear of success. But he had said, the worst case scenario isn't that the event doesn't work out, it's that the event does work, because then you have to do more stuff. That's true. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. That's somewhat helpful.
So I have a question on like, we all know that it's normal to have a failure or like to fail sometimes. How can we face it when we get extremely sad about it, or like we get extremely put down by a failure? How can we deal with it?
There's two parts to this. There's one is like a community that we can do. What that tends to look like is, especially these days, failure is a huge, huge weight. And failure tends to not be seen in a vacuum. Like, we see it in the like scope of a global thing. We see failure both in a way that is much, much more public these days, but also still our ego sees failure as much more serious than it really is. When we reach out to somebody or want to reach out to somebody, for example, we assume that this person is gonna think that we're weird or is gonna, reject us and not like us. Or, we go to wear something like a new thing we bought and we're worried about how people might judge that or they might like it. When realistically, like the people don't actually care that much. They're so worried about themselves and people judging them that oftentimes going in and acknowledging that that fear exists and going anyways seems to disarm people because you seem very confident and very charismatic, even though you also are afraid, which kind of leads to two pieces. So one, as a community, really important to support people through failure, to help people redefine failure for themselves. We look back on some of the most successful people, oftentimes in contrast of their failures, or how they became heroes after failing. Society really values people who seem to overcome a huge disadvantage, seem to grow from that. It's really just about the narrative. It's really about the mindset of it. People who share vulnerability don't come off as weaker, they come off as confident. So, kind of the last step of it is having compassion for that process, kind of rewarding ourselves for healthy self talk. And built into this, too, I think it's important to look at the way that we assign goals to ourselves and how that can dictate our sense of failure or fear of failure. Very importantly, there's approaching goals and avoiding goals. A good example of this is positive psychology and positive psychology's approach to diet. A lot of the times when somebody goes to therapy for, say, overeating, they'll oftentimes say, why do I look like this? Why do I eat so much? Why do I punish myself like this? All of this, it's really negative self talk. It inherently is building more anxiety, more stress around the situation, the topic. What we attempt to do instead is reframe that, reshape that to how do I feel better? How do I eat healthier? The other questions, those are really hard to answer. Why do I do this to myself? Yeah, I mean, now we've got to dive into a really long chain of questioning that ultimately is just bringing more fear, more anxiety, more stress.
I have another question that I think can be important and interesting for all of us. We keep hearing all of those, that the motivational videos that says when you fail, that's another reason to not stop. Don't stop yourself. Like failing is like falling 8 times, standing up 9 times. But there must be a moment when you should understand. Okay, that's most probably not my road. Like we failed the 1,000 exam. How do we understand if that's the stopping point for us where we should say, okay, listen, this is not my road? And when is it that we can understand, oh, I'll just do it better? Is there any way that we can find that out?
There is a approach in psychology called cognitive behavioral therapy. And one of the great practices that they have is making a list and checking it to be realistic or unrealistic. So maybe I'm having a panic attack. I feel like I can't breathe. Now, it might seem kind of bizarre to stop and do a list to figure out if I can or can't breathe, but that is where we begin. So I might make a list that has all of the proofs that this is in fact a panic attack, and then all of the proofs that this isn't a panic attack. I actually cannot breathe. And on this list, I might write, well, I'm breathing really shallow. It feels like my breath isn't, it just doesn't feel right. So maybe that is a proof that I can't breathe. Am I able to talk right now? As I'm talking to myself, like, yeah, well, if I couldn't breathe, I couldn't talk. So there's some proof that I can breathe. What other proofs? And I'm going back and forth, and I'm not trying to be optimistic. I'm trying to be realistic. And I've been making this list for about like 10 minutes. So, yeah, I probably can breathe. This was probably a panic attack. And doing this with all of the things that we fear can be really, really valuable. It is a very much about that identification process. When I catch that, hey, gee, you know what? I noticed that I'm not sleeping well lately. I have a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. I'm just putting that out there. Now I'm starting to invite people into it, this fear that other people could know or that I might seem like less of a success. Other people are now seeing it. And I'm actually getting the complete opposite of what I feared. People are saying, oh, hey, it's okay. Do you need anything? Or like, how can I be of help? Okay, now it's a little bit easier to start identifying some of the components of this and what I need to do.
Then like, we've been talking about how we perceive failure, how society perceives failures, but there is another important factor in this, and it's parents. How influential are our parents on our perspective on failure?
And how we approach failure, what we see as failure, a lot of this stuff begins very, very early on in childhood. These are things we see by example. These are things that are told explicitly to us. We might see this really from the start with our parents, related to work, related to school. For the most part, parents are doing these things based on their experiences. It can be really tough to be in an environment that is based in a lot of fear or where there's a lot of pressure around succeeding in some way, especially if the parents carry some kind of trauma where they feel like a failure and then further pass that pressure on to you to help you avoid it. They've just made it even harder. I think being realistic, even with some of the things that our parents say, is helpful.
Thank you again, Jason, for being here as always. I really appreciate the time you're taking here. And I'll see you next week. We haven't decided what it's going to be next week. If you have any suggestions, specific topic that you really want to be talked about, you can do it on Discord. There is a channel called Jason Talk. You can just type in there whatever you want. Thank you so much again, Jason. I really appreciate you being here. I'll
It's
see
my
you
pleasure.
next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Hello! 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 A very important thing to do. Right after learning something, you have to repeat what you learned, right? That's exactly what we're gonna do right now. What is the one thing that you will retain in your brain from this talk? Me personally is share, identity, control, compassion, and then reward yourself. I really like to have like a little bit of something that I can know I can go through.